Hey, Rhody Nation. I'm your host, Scott Brand. It's time for another edition of the Go Rhody Sports Podcast. Today, we are going to unravel the mysteries of the NIL, which stands for name, image, and likeness. And now I want to reveal the name, image, and likeness of our guest, Andy Wittry. So let's get started. We have a lot to cover. But first, let's start very simple. What is the NIL? And I know that's a very broad question, but if you could simplify a little bit for our audience, there's so many people, I believe maybe you could think differently, that don't know what the NIL is. And it's just such a powerful entity right now in college sports with such more power to come.
I think it's a good question, frankly. And to your point, it might sound simplistic if I can maybe steal a point from someone that I know and respect a lot, Courtney Ultimus, who runs an NIL education and consulting provider Advance. Is that, she talks to a lot of high school athletes and college athletes. And she was saying, a lot of athletes don't understand what the acronym stands for. So I think it's a fair question. So name, image, and likeness, to put it simply, your name is your name, right? So for me, it's Andy. For you, it's Scott. Image is like a picture of yourself, right? It could be your headshot, a photo of you, and your likeness. I think the easiest way to maybe portray that is maybe in a video game, right? Of It's something that represents you. It may not be your exact photo or exact picture, but some way it could be, perhaps maybe your voice, could be maybe a nickname, but it's some way that identifies you that's not directly, it's not Andy, it's not your name, and it's not your exact photo, but a way that you could be portrayed and people, consumers, viewers might know who this person is. So it's your rights of publicity. And for college sports, you have to have some, catchphrase or some acronym that is good for search engine optimization and good for kind of inside baseball discussions. And so for college sports, it's NIL. Is a lack of enforcement, through the first 2+ years of this era. The NCAA has not announced an official NCAA violation. There was one that was maybe more recruiting and tangentially referenced NIL, but was not NIL specific. So in the meantime, if you're driving 85 down the highway and you see no signs of police or anyone enforcing that, well, what if we go 90? What if we go 95? So I think NIL is really a bridge to something greater, something larger, that could look like revenue share, that could look like potential employment status, most likely for maybe football and men's and women's basketball players, maybe other sports as well. But for the here and now, it's NIL, and it's coming closer to in-house at the institution. And I really think it's a bridge to something that's greater than NIL.
I love that analogy. And for what speed is it at now? 120? Or
If you're in Texas, if you're going from maybe
yeah.
Austin to El Paso and going across the state, yeah, you might be pushing 105, 110 right now. Yeah, we're actually up to, I think, as of today at lunchtime, roughly, we're up to now 31 different states that have passed some sort of high school NIL. Either it's the
Wow.
association by law, or in a few cases, it's literal like state law. So I think for now, that is an overwhelming majority of states that have something that they have passed. But a lot of the key states, as far as what you think about major, the top revenue producing sports, football, men's basketball specifically, a lot of those states that produce a lot of those key elite recruits still don't allow it. We're talking about Texas, Florida, Georgia, Ohio, Alabama, Mississippi. So for now, even though it's the majority of states, maybe the majority of the states that really matter from a recruiting perspective are still holding out. So that's actually kind of the key, not key conflict, that's overstating it, but sort of the dichotomy, right, of majority of number of states, but perhaps maybe the majority of elite recruits of, pick your 4 and 5 star blue chip types still technically can't, at least maybe until, their season's over and they have no high school eligibility to risk losing at that point. So that's really the current landscape for high school, is the fact that there are a lot of smaller states that may not produce a lot of 4 and 5 star recruits that allow it. But as far as your big, especially southern states, they still have not really moved on that issue, besides, Louisiana, Tennessee, with a few exceptions.
And you mentioned the schools that still don't have NIL, the high schools. That can't be a coincidence. It sounds like similar schools in that list. Did you find a pattern, a reason why they haven't approved high school yet?
it's tricky because that jumps out immediately, right, Scott? Where you're like, okay,
Yeah.
so it's Florida, it's Georgia, it's Alabama. It feels like it's like half the SEC footprint. But then, conversely, to kind of to make a rebuttal to that point, Louisiana was one of the first states that did allow it at the high school level, and
Yeah.
they produced a lot of recruits. LSU, the year that they've had, or this past year, LSU to win two national championships, have a lot of success in athletics. Like, okay, well, how do we square those two things where LSU and Louisiana are over here, but a lot of those other, peer SEC footprint states still have not. So it's tough to pin down.
Who's going to make the first move to make changes? Is it going to be the NCAA? It seems like they should be doing something at some point, or they're hatching something.
I would say, technically, I think the right answer is the states. It was the states that
Okay.
prompted the NCAA to act at the 11th hour. And I think it was June 30th of 2021 when they passed their interim NIL policy, which is still in existence, right? It's still
Mm-hmm.
technically, it's still the interim policy more than 2 years in. And now we're
Yeah.
seeing the ways that states looking at, your Texases, Arkansas's, Missouri, New York, the ways that their state legislatures, often at the request of their major schools, looking at Mizzou, Syracuse, Texas A&M, that are lobbying pretty heavily. We're talking about government relations offices, ADs, associate ADs, coaches that are campaigning and lobbying for these bills. So that's the answer as far as first move of, what, if there's not going to be actual enforcement from an NCAA perspective, if there's not going to be a federal bill that even receives the chance to go before committee or to be voted upon, there's roughly we call it a dozen plus bills that have been introduced and none have gone to a vote. So at this point, it's up to the states. So
Yeah.
what's next? I think it's a one-upsmanship. It's state after state after state. And then at some point, whatever that next big change looks like, if that is revenue sharing, if that is employee status, that's going to come from a federal agency or the courts, I believe.
Can you tell me about the difference in conferences per se, in the P5 and P6s, and maybe the Atlantic 10, as far as how much money the schools are spending on keep retaining athletes or recruiting athletes? Do you have those figures since you're so close with On3 at your disposal?
It is tricky, right? Because a lot of the stuff there are ways to have some verifiable numbers. Some states, so actually Texas, prior to July 1st, as part of their state law, athletes had to disclose their deals to the school. Those are then public record at public schools, and so especially like the local media in Texas for A&M, for UT, would file public records requests and find out, okay, athletes at whatever school it is reported, this much in NIL revenue over the course of, this year or this quarter, maybe even break it down, by gender or by sport. So there are some ways to have actual, public deal disclosure. Now, that's just a partial window. We know not every deal is disclosed. So
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of a lead into saying it's really hard to say for sure what's
Yeah.
going on at each school. So you got to really just vet people and hopefully talk to a lot of different people that you trust. And I try to report things often maybe as ranges, right, versus specific of hey, for this level of school it might be in this kind of range. So for as far as men's basketball, looking at what does that landscape look like? The very top tier based on my reporting at On3, the very highest end of collectives or schools that have like the highest level of donor and business support, you're looking at maybe $2 million plus. And that could be from fans and donors, that could be from businesses. If you are maybe a former 5-star recruit or projected first rounder, you might actually have some legitimate, like real branding value to national brands. And so that money isn't just coming from fans. You might have major apparel companies or major food and beverage companies, and that money is offsetting. It's not just on the fans, but it's also not just on Nike, because Nike is obviously very picky about who they're going to sponsor as a high school or college athlete. So there's kind of a trickle down effect where if that's the highest range, is call it maybe 2 to 3 million for your very most aggressive, most supportive collectives out there. You know what? A lot of Power Five and I guess high major, right? Because Power Five is more of a football term than men's basketball. For maybe your average high major program that has that support, maybe is it closer to 500,000 to 1 million, somewhere in that range, right? Which is still that's a big range, right? Because you're doubling from that low end of that range to that high end. But I do think if you're just kind of in the game and wanting to be, are we, in the mix? That's probably the range you're looking at. And if you're maybe, like a mid major or low major, is that number then between, somewhere between 150, 300, 500,000 ish? And it could depend on the year, right? Do you have someone that maybe is a reigning first team all conference player that you think maybe they're not quite a future NBA player, not quite a draftable player now, but do we want to make sure they don't transfer? Then you might have to raise some more funds to make sure that, hey, let's show that this player, or maybe a few players even, that we can support them here at our school. So it can be a year by year thing based on what's our current roster. Do we have a lot of scholarships to fill? Maybe we have some transfers coming in that maybe part of their incentive or part of the reason to come here is because they heard the players last year that they made money. So there really is a range from, like the low major end, maybe you're signing players for, are they making 5 or 10 grand annually, just if you're like a low major collective, or at the very highest end, this past transfer cycle. It was a big window when the transfer portal opened this past spring, but kind of in the middle of it, I did a big story on kind of the state of the portal and NIL. And at that time, speaking, it was from basically 3 different sources I trust, that the highest reported offer that each of them had heard was basically roughly, call it $800,000 for a player, right? So there's going to be low major and mid major collectives or schools. They won't hit 800,000 annually, right? But for the very most elite, think maybe your top 5-ish, maybe top 10-ish men's basketball transfers, that they're going to command, probably 500,000 plus. And maybe that won't all come from donors, but it might be donors, businesses, and that they're going to reach, maybe 500,000 to a million.
And we lost a player at Rhode Island, Ish Leggett. I don't know if you know him, but he was our star player at Rhode Island, and he transferred to Pittsburgh. I'm wondering what could have happened legally. Could Rhode Island possibly have given him anywhere from $50,000 to $100,000? And then Pittsburgh swoops in. Are they allowed to tell him how much they can give him? I seem to think that's pay for play, and they're not allowed to do that. But that doesn't really mean anything legally, because there's the real world and there's the law. So what's that about with someone like Ish Leggett as an example? So it's a big problem, I think. What actually could happen in that scenario?
I won't speak on specific. I don't know what exactly happened with him and his decision.
Not specifics, but just pretend, it's other players or just player A going from school A to school B.
Sure. I mean, there's a variety, now that compensation can be part of, the formula of, okay, well, playing time, development, facilities, distance from home. Is there a major program or grad program I want to pursue? There's a lot of factors. And so now NIL compensation is a very real part of that. And it'll vary player to player, right? Based on what's your family situation. You know what? Like do you have a kid? Are one of your parents sick? Like what's going on if you were maybe that the incentive or the need might vary from case to case. So for some players, surely that might be largely, I mean, Hunter Dickinson from Michigan, maybe the highest profile men's basketball transfer in this era. It's still a young era, but maybe so far
for now.
He was very public on his podcast saying that he made less than $100,000 last season at Michigan. And, based on who he is and, his brand power, his talents, Kansas's support of NIL, he will very likely make, multiple factors more than that, and taking him at his word that he made less than $100,000 last year. So there can be an order of operations where, coaches can say, our players last year made this. And, there's different levels of, how much, innuendo or kind of, wink, wink, nudge, nudge is there in that process. But, within the rules, and once again, that's where it gets into laws versus bylaws of, these are just NCAA bylaws, right? Is it a coach could say our players last year on our roster made this, or if, our starting 2 guard, he made this much last year. And there's nothing wrong about that. And now that there's ways that, coaches can help promote collectives, fundraise for them, maybe, attend a banquet or a dinner or a fundraiser to help support them financially or help, encourage fans to show up and have the fans donate to the collective. So there are ways that, completely within the NCAA bylaws, they can be transparent. Now, under the rules, you couldn't say, I will give you, $500,000 to come here, transfer portal player X. But there are ways you can kind of toe that line and do something kind of similar, but it's sort of the order of operations and the manner in which you do so to, theoretically stay compliant in that process.
How did the NIL come about? I know the Supreme Court passed down the law, but what was this? Why did it take so long? Why was it now?
It's a great question. There's a lot of layers to it. I mean, frankly, and that's kind of actually kind of the misnomer is that, technically there was that Supreme Court ruling that pertained to the NCAA in June of 2021. So the same month they implemented their interim NIL policy, but it was actually a different issue. So it was not about NIL. You could argue that maybe the ramifications, especially of the 9-0 result of that decision, maybe had ripple effects that could have touched their approach to NIL, but that was actually based on kind of like limited education related benefits. So essentially players can now, or athletes can now receive basically almost up to $6,000 annually if their school or conference chooses to, allow schools to provide that award. And it's basically, that's because I guess that the highest value of your like athletic, trophies or awards, the highest possible amount is $5,980. That's why they chose that amount for, I think, like the academic rewards. And so that's basically if the school has a policy saying, hey, if you make the honor roll or you get at least a 3.2 GPA and you volunteer, 2 hours a semester in the community, we'll give you this award. So that's what that Supreme Court decision was all about. And the timing, because it was, boom, 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 all these things happened kind of concurrently. That's why there was that misnomer. So it was not the Supreme Court. It was California. I believe it was maybe late September of 2019 when Governor Gavin Newsom signed an act. It was Senate Bill 206, the Fair Pay to Play Act. And that was the first one that prompted this era. And the implementation date initially, I believe, was January 1st, 2023. So, this past winter that we just finished. Florida then kind of had their own version of a law, and in many respects followed suit, but they moved up the implementation effective date to July 1st, 2021. Once Florida did that, other states had followed, especially in the South and the Southeast. And that's what prompted this era specifically to start in the summer of 2021.
Can smaller schools compete? And that's a question that I wanted to ask you with your knowledge and experience. And
sure, I think you look at the Final Four from this past men's basketball tournament. FAU not only kept their coach and signed him to a 10-year contract. So in many ways, this is similar to the coaching carousel, right? Of what's going to stop when FAU makes the Final Four. What's going to stop a bigger school from coming in and trying to hire him based upon his success? And a lot of that probably has some similar threads with NIL. And FAU kept basically every rotation player that still had eligibility. They had 2 collectives that launched this past spring, maybe winter when they officially started, but really this past spring. So they retained their coach and the key players that mattered from last year's Final Four team. So that's one example. San Diego State, they didn't keep everyone from last year's team that made the national title game, but some players, and they have a collective and they pay every player the same amount. It's not, I think the budget was roughly maybe $350,000, I believe, if you kind of there was a comment that they told the Union Tribune about what they pay per month, and you multiply that by 12 months, the number of players, and I think it was roughly, call it maybe $350,000 ish, right? And they made the national title game, and like Lamont Butler, who hit one of the greatest shots in the history of the sport in the college game, elected to stay there, right? Could have left, could have had a rising profile veteran player, played for a title, and he chose to stay, right? Now that's not to say that you probably will lose players to the portal. That's just reality, right? But so do so do some of the blue bloods. Look at North Carolina had several young players that transferred, and there's a chance that some of those players, especially if they're looking for more playing time, more shots, they might go down to an A10 school because you know what? If I'm a former 4-star top 100 recruit in my class, and it didn't really work out at a high major or an ACC school, SEC school, but I want to play 32 minutes a night and take 12 shots a game, maybe I can do that in the Mountain West A10 Conference USA, American Athletic Conference, and become a first team all conference player and maybe reap the NIL rewards that level has to offer too. So it's not all doom and gloom. There's no way that you can really totally prevent it. But I would say there are examples looking back as recently as, March, April, May, this past tournament in the portal cycle, that there are reasons to be optimistic if you are a Rhode Island fan.
Has this happened where the players are savvy enough now to play the media to make more money by putting out a press release and saying, I'm not happy here at Miami. I'm only because player B got 800,000 and I'm playing just as good as him and I'm going to transfer. I know it's a dicey question.
No, I would say yes. And now probably not the player themselves, at least publicly. That's more so the role of agent, which is kind of this undefined, ambiguous term in this era, because some might work for a major agency that you've heard of. Some might be a sophomore in college, right? That happened to go to high school with a player or happened to live down the hall freshman year. You mentioned Miami and you mentioned that dollar figure of $800,000 pretty specifically, looking back at the last offseason after the 2022 season, because that's what happened with
Nigel Pack.
Isaiah Wong.
Yeah.
Well, he was when Nigel Pack transferred. John Ruiz was very public in saying that, hey, this is a 2-year, $800,000 deal with the car. And Isaiah Wong, who was, I believe, the team's leading returning scorer, coming back to Miami, his agent talked to ESPN and basically said that we're going to renegotiate or try to renegotiate with John Ruiz, who his money is maybe more on paper or in theory than actuality, given how his business has performed, but who has been a kind of on paper billionaire, at least at moments, might still be, I'm not quite sure, but they try to play hardball kind of through ESPN with Isaiah Wong's agent to ESPN, kind of communicating to this Miami billionaire. So that's a very high profile example. You're not going to see a lot of that. There's a lot of that's almost kind of a Mad Lib, right? Of that city that the program, the businessman is worth at the time. But I do think that there are ways that agents, and that is part of their job, right? If they're going to maximize their client's value as their client's representation, is it, they might play games with, okay, do we enter the portal or threaten to enter the portal? Or do we talk to the media or talk to the coach and find ways of if these two things now intersect, NIL and the transfer portal, there are ways that, players or, their family or their inner circle or their agent, whoever they're working with, they can try to leverage that situation to their advantage if they so choose.
And some of these smaller schools, they sound like they don't have the means to compete, but if you have a large donor, then all of a sudden now they could compete with the big boys. And there's a lot of schools, mid-majors and low majors, that do have the means and do compete. So that's another avenue for smaller schools to compete with the larger ones. These two kids here, are you familiar with them? The Cavinder twins.
I am.
That's some story, isn't it? They came from Fresno
It's ongoing.
State.
I mean, there's a lot of kind of faces of NIL, and for the first 2 years, there's a lot of athletes, or not a lot, but there was some competition for which athletes claim to have, the first NIL deal of, the NCAA's NIL era. There's lots of attempts for earned media and people claiming firsts and unprecedented and never before seen. But they were part of that with, a deal at, I think, 12:01 or maybe even midnight, July 1st of 2021. And they've been very active and had a lot of on-court success, especially, this past season at Miami, and now have launched. I mean, they're essentially they're business owners, right, of their own brand, and we're seeing, could that lead to actual careers in the WWE because they've partnered with them? Could that lead to, fashion or other type of businesses that they maybe just start their own company, right, because they have that platform?
Where are they now? Are they still playing collegiate basketball? Still at Miami?
No, so they both elected not to use their extra year of eligibility due to the COVID-19 pandemic. They've signed, I believe, with Better. It's Jake Paul, the influencer or wannabe boxer or fighter, whatever you want to call him. He is a company that I believe they've partnered with or signed on with. So they're no longer college athletes, but they've built a brand, right? And they've transcended, just women's basketball or just Miami or whatever box that people may have thought they were in. I think they're big enough names in large part due to their work and branding that they can now take that, and that kind of can be their career if that's what they want that to be.
It's funny because not too long ago, we were having a conversation about how the WNBA was grossly underpaid compared to the NBA. And then there were people that said, well, they're not making the money that the LeBrons or other stars make. And all of a sudden now you have this equalizer with the Cavinder twins and so many other players from LSU, star players that, and it'll probably fall through into the WNBA because their name, image, and likeness will be known when they're drafted. I think it's the WNBA will do well with this. And then there's the dark side of the NIL, and we're talking about John Ruiz, who comes in and he turns the University of Miami into the football team now, legally. But he's bringing in $800K for the first guy, Nigel Pack, and then it's off to the races. But he put together a team of people, and he has cigarette racing, and he's making a lot of money with a lot of different things. So I kind of call Miami the ground zero, and I think a lot of others will be following that business model. Do you foresee a future of separate FBS and FCS divisions for basketball as we currently have for football? Will the big money separate the teams into two or more levels in the long run?
I could see maybe football, because right now football, like the NCAA technically doesn't like govern. They don't run the championship for football, right? The CFP, the College Football Playoff, is its own entity. That's the one where the NCAA still has some level of kind of sort of like rulemaking authority, but they're not the ones that run that champion. They run everything else, and so the bulk of their money as an association comes from the Division I men's basketball tournament. And I would say it's probably the greatest postseason event in sports, right? Maybe biased as a college basketball fan, but it's a pretty awesome event and it generates a whole bunch of revenue, and that number's only going up, right? So I think it would be pretty insane to threaten that model. Not that theoretically, if you're playing some game theory, sure, if you said just the Power Five or just the high majors or whatever cutoff point you want to say, you said, oh, what if they spun off their own thing, made their own tournament, sold it, bundled their rights? They could, but I think there might be some pushback. We saw maybe not be the one-to-one equivalent, but with the whole Super League notion, and like European soccer, people literally rioted, right, and were very upset. I don't know if we'd reach that level here in the States over college hoops, but I think you would anger a lot of fans, and I do think there's something about the Cinderella run in your FAUs and your St. Peter's and your San Diego States that I don't think they're going to mess with that. So my gut answer is no. I really don't think that.
So Andy, thanks so much for coming in. I just have one more question for you. How much can my podcast get in terms of my views and subscribers? How much NIL dollars can I get? Be nice to me here.
YouTube has a very strong monetization platform. So the athletes that do have a YouTube channel with a lot of follow, like you've seen some Colorado football players have one, and that's a pretty good monetization. So you know what? If you've hit those goals of hours watched and subscribers, there's real money, Scott. So I won't put a number on it. We'll talk to the overlords at YouTube, but there's a real potential there.
Well, Andy, I'm going to do you a favor, and I'm going to encourage all my fans to go on your website. Maybe we could do a promotion for one of those beautiful hats there on 3. Have your people talk to my people. But once again, thanks for letting us share your brain. You're an NIL expert. Thanks again, Andy.
Of course. Thanks, Scott.
Okay.